Hey, I'm Dan Thomas, and welcome to my channel for the Newbie Woodworker, or anyone really. I'm going to show you how to make this adjustable router jig. You can use it to cut a dado the exact size for something like a shelf, with no measuring. You can also use it to route cutouts, like the one I made for this boombox. If that sounds interesting to you, stick around. I got the idea for this template from another video, and I'll put a link to it in the description below, but as you'll see as we go along, I made some changes too. The original arms are about 24 inches long, and I made a set of them that length, but they're kind of cumbersome for smaller work, so I also made a 12-inch set. I can even mix and match them if I need to. So let's start with the TTracks. They're made out of 1/2-inch plywood, 1 inch wide. They need to be about 1 inch longer than the base, so they can overlap the other bases, like this. I'm using 1/4-inch T-bolts. You could also use carriage bolts and grind 2 sides of the head flat, but they don't slide as smoothly. I've also heard you can use toilet bolts. I'm going to cut a slot for the T-bolts right down the middle of the stock, 2.5 inches from one end and 1 inch from the other. I'll demonstrate this first with my router table, then with a handheld router. But even if you don't have a router table, watch this first. I want the slot to be a little wider than my 1/4-inch T-bolt, so I'm using a 5/16 inch bit. If you don't have one, then just use the 1/4-inch bit, or whatever size bit matches your T-bolt. I set the bit height to half the thickness of the stock and make one cut. Then I raised the bit the rest of the way and cut all the way through. At this point, if you only have the 1/4-inch bit, move the fence back just a little and make one more cut. That should give you some wiggle room in the slot. I'm using a couple of clamps to save my fence position. Then I change to a bit wide enough for the T-bolt heads, which for me is a 1/2 inch. Then I set the bit height to half the thickness of my stock, which for me is a 1/4 inch. I cut all along the existing slot, so it's wide enough for the head of the T-bolt. Then I raised the bit all the way up and cut through for about 3/4 of an inch at the short end of the stock. This makes a sort of keyhole so I can put the T-bolt in and take it out easily. So that's the idea, but routing 1-inch wide stock isn't the easiest or safest thing to do, as you probably noticed. So I actually recommend cutting all 4 T-tracks at once. For example, if I'm going to cut 4 13-inch T-tracks, and each one will be 1 inch wide, I know the first slot is at a 1/2 inch. My table saw blade's kerf is 1/8 of an inch, so that means the next T-slot goes at 1 5/8 of an inch. And so on. Which means I need at least 4 3/8 of an inch of stock. And of course, each slot should be cut in the same place. Then I just set my rib fence to 1 inch and cut the 4 T-tracks apart. Much easier. If you don't have a router table, you can cut the T-tracks using a handheld router. You'll definitely want to do all 4 tracks at the same time. It's too hard to clamp and route stock that's only 1 inch wide. So obviously mark everything beforehand. Then set up a straight edge to run your router against. I recommend making this edge guide jig I showed in a previous video. It makes it really easy to do this type of routing. Since this isn't a high-powered router, I'm taking 3 passes to cut the 1/4-inch slot all the way through. I don't have a 5/16 inch bit for this router, so I move the straight edge back just a little and widen out the track. Then I put it back and cut the 1/2 inch portion. And the keyhole. And obviously you'd repeat this for the remaining 3 T-tracks. After cutting the T-tracks, sand the tracks so the T-bolts will slide smoothly. I'm using my portable sanding station and some flexible contour sanding grips to get inside the tracks. Links for the sanding station build video and the sanding grips and other products are in the description below or on my website. The next step is to glue the T-tracks to their bases. I made the bases out of 1/4 inch MDF. As I said before, cut them to 1 inch shorter than the T-tracks. I'll explain the widths later on. It's really easy to accidentally squeeze the T-track when you glue it, causing the slot to be too narrow for the T-bolt. So get a piece of scrap wood the same thickness as the T-track and cut a spacer the right width so that it positions the T-track in the middle of the base, and then get another scrap for the other side. Tape the edges of the spacers so glue squeeze-out doesn't stick to them. I also put some tape on the base to keep it clean too. I tried using normal painter's tape, but it damages the MDF when you remove it, so I'm using frog tape instead. Here's what happened when I didn't put tape down on the base when I was gluing the T-track down. See all the squeeze out? The one I used tape on looks much cleaner. Then add a bunch of painter's tape to the top of the T-track so it sticks up above the spacers, so when you add the clamps, they'll be sure to push the T-track down. We're going to glue it down with the keyhole end of the T-track flush with one end of the base, so that means there's an inch on this end that doesn't need glue. So go ahead and add the glue, but try not to use too much because we want to keep squeeze out to a minimum. Now, keeping the keyhole end flush with one end of the base, put the T-track between the spacers. Then carefully clamp it down and let the glue dry. After the glue is dried, unclamp it and remove the tape. Clean up any squeeze out as best you can. Make sure the T-bolts slide in the T-slots and don't get stuck. If they do get stuck, then you've probably got glue squeeze out inside the T-track, so do your best to try and clean it up. Next up are the tabs, which is this part here that goes over the T-bolt in another T-track. The original design used screws, but it turns out they're not really needed. I made the tabs out of 1/4 inch MDF, 4 inches long and 1 inch wide, with a 5/16 inch slot along the middle of the tab, 1.5 inches long, and an inch in from one side. As we did before, you should cut all the slots at one time, so it's easier to clamp the MDF down. I had made a template when I was going to use screws, but you can just mark where to cut by hand. Here's some layouts for 2 tabs side by side to give you some ideas. It doesn't matter if your kerf is smaller than what I've got here, it'll be close enough. I'm using my edge guide jig that I mentioned previously to make it easy to route in the right place. And then I cut them apart. Now we're ready to glue on the tabs. They go on the end of the T-track that sticks out, 2 inches in from the end. I glued them on with CA glue and activator, but you could use regular wood glue if you feel like waiting around for the glue to dry. I used another arm so it was supported when I pressed down on it. Now we're going to trim the bases, and you'll see how to figure out how wide to make your bases. I'm marking the bases with 1/4 inch on one side and 1/2 on the other. Make sure you stay consistent. I put a 1/4 inch bit in my router and run it along the 1/4 inch side. Now I know that this side of the base will be the right size for when I use 1/4 inch bits. Then I put a 1/2 inch bit in my router and cut all the 1/2 inch sides. So now I know this side will work when I use 1/2 inch bits. You don't have to use both sides. You could just decide on one size bit and only use that bit. So when you make your bases, they need to be wide enough so there's some extra that you can trim with your router, either on one side or both sides. If you make them too narrow, you'll have to start over, or at least rip the T-tracks off the MDF and see if you can salvage them. One thing to think about is whether your router base is symmetrical or not. This one isn't. It's wider this way than this. So if I've got the jig set up so that this is the right width for a bit when the router is facing this direction, what happens when I get to this side? I'll actually cut into the base here because the distance to the bit is shorter on this side of the router base. In a previous video, I showed how to make symmetrical router bases. With a symmetrical base, you can run the router all around the jig and it'll work perfectly. So consider making a symmetrical router base if you need to. You might discover that your pieces don't fit flush together. That's probably because you have glue squeeze out in the way. Here's an easy way to fix it. Raise your table saw's blade until it's high enough to just barely touch the bottom of the T-track, then use it to trim down the squeeze out. If you cut a little off the base or a little off the T-track, don't worry about it. After that, they should fit nice and snugly. So let's use this thing. Let's say you want to make a dado in this piece of wood, so this piece fits like this. I could do this with my 1/4" bit, but I'm going to do it with my 1/2" bit. So get all the pieces lined up with the 1/2" sides on the inside, and add washers and wing nuts to all the T-bolts. Now put the stock inside the jig and close up the jig around it. You should always make a test cut first, which I've done, and I learned the dado is just a little too tight, so I'm adding a piece of paper. That should do it. This is one side of where I want the dado. So line up the jig along that line and clamp it down. Then run the router inside the jig. And here's the result. Turns out that when I set the bit depth, I forgot about the extra 1/4" the jig adds, but you get the idea. For this example, I marked out where I wanted a router recessed square. Line up the jig so the edges of the jig line up along the square. Clamp it down. Run the router inside the jig. And that's all it takes. So don't forget you can find product and video links in the description below. On my website, you can find some diagrams for this build, along with product and video links. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider leaving a comment. Subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to ring that bell so you get notified whenever I release a new video. Thanks!